This is How About That Podcast, a show dedicated to all things Dallas Cowboys. With both objective and subjective perspectives, How About That Podcast is your place to hear about America's team. Now, here's Joseph Hoyt and Danny Morales.
Welcome back to another episode of How About That Podcast, episode number 3. And here in Dallas, Texas, the sun is shining, but that's not the case for you, Danny, is it?
Pouring rain, hail, overcast, not looking too good. No, not so sunny California.
No, and then Joey, it's not sunny where you're at either, huh?
It's been hailing the past 2-3 days, I'd say, and it's supposed to be rain and hail or any sort of a mix up for the next 2 days. So,
well, for those of you who don't know, I'm in Dallas, Texas. My name is Joseph Hoyt. Danny Morales is in San Bruno, California, and Joey Aliberti's out in Massachusetts. We are covering the entire country, but right now the sun is only shining on the great state of Texas. And the sun is only shining on a Cowboys off season, right, Danny?
You could say that, yeah. Mostly overcast, but we'll be optimistic.
Hey, the thing about the weather is it changes, right? So, first thing I wanted to do is kind of introduce the fact that we have our first guest today. Joey Ickes, who wrote for Cowboys Wire, blogging The Boys, The Athletic, and recently has just been given some really good information on Twitter, mostly about the salary cap and how it affects the Dallas Cowboys. It's been kind of an interesting topic considering the narrative that, hey, the Cowboys don't have a lot of cap space. And if you kind of look at their free agent moves, as we've talked about, not really all in. We're going to talk with Joey kind of explaining that and really taking a look at what they could have done or where they're at currently. It's a fun conversation. We already recorded with him. So, Danny, what were your kind of takeaways from Joey's presentation?
Key word would be frustration. As a fan, and I think as most just fans of the NFL, we don't have a full understanding of the salary cap, and it's a lot for finance guys. It's pretty easy to them, but for me, it's a lot of terms and numbers and stuff. It's over my head. I hear contracts converted into signing bonuses and all this stuff means nothing to me. All I hear is we're over the cap. We're against the cap. We got $6 million in cap. So going into the offseason, my kind of understanding is that they don't really have much money to spend. But then you look at a team like Miami, who's got just as much, if not less money, and the way that they can kind of maneuver contracts and manipulate the system kind of makes you wonder, is Jerry really doing everything he can to go, quote, all in? And hearing Joey explain the different nuances of what you can do and how much you can manipulate the system really makes you wonder, why is Jerry and front office not doing all these things that they can be doing? Because there are options, apparently, which I didn't really know.
Yeah, we talk often about how the cap is a myth. And some teams can navigate that and other teams kind of can't. And eventually, price tags come due, which kind of brings me to my next point of another team that has had some salary cap issues actually this year was the Buffalo Bills. And we're recording on Thursday, April 4th. This comes out on Monday. But I think it's noteworthy that we had a huge trade in the NFL just yesterday on Wednesday. The Bills got rid of Stephon Diggs, Danny. They sent him to Houston for a 2025 second-round pick. So not even a second-round pick in this coming draft. And in turn, the Texans not only got Stephon Diggs, but they also got a 5th and a 6th-round pick, one of those being in this coming season or this coming draft. So, Joey, you also write about the Texans a lot. What was your reaction to seeing Stephon Diggs on the move to a team that has done a lot this offseason?
Well, my initial reaction was probably something I shouldn't say on this podcast just because I was so surprised of seeing that. But then I thought about it a little more, and I wasn't really that surprised because earlier, before Keenan Allen had gotten traded to the Chicago Bears, it was reported that the Texans offered, I think it was a 3rd-round pick. It might have been that 2nd round. I forget exactly what it was, but you could tell they were looking for an extra, higher level wide receiver to add via trade, not before the draft happened. And I didn't expect it to be Stephon Diggs. It kind of makes sense also from the standpoint of it didn't seem like everything was going smoothly. Another offseason of weird Bills rumors with Diggs and Allen and their relationship and everything like that. I think it makes a lot of sense. And now CJ Stroud is absolutely loaded in his second year. And it's not, I would say that there's probably the Chiefs, the Bengals, and I don't know. Other than that, I can't really think of teams that have higher expectations going into this year than the Houston Texans in the AFC.
Yeah, according to Bet Online AG, the Texans after that trade jumped from 22-1 odds to 10-1 odds to win the Super Bowl, climbing over a bunch of teams, including the Cowboys, who are at 18-1 currently. One other note about that trade: the Cowboys do play the Texans this coming season. That means Stephon Diggs. We could finally get Stephon Diggs and Trayvon Diggs versus each other, like we could have had last season if Trayvon Diggs didn't have a season-ending injury. Hopefully, that game happens on Thanksgiving. That just feels right. A Houston-Dallas battle over Thanksgiving dinner with Trayvon and Stephon going at it every single play. Danny, that seems like the logical destination for that game, right?
I'd love to see it. And what's interesting to me about that trade, my first thought was the expectations weren't really there from Houston. They were kind of the ones doing the chasing. Now they're going to be the team that everyone's gunning for. So it'll be interesting to see how CJ Stroud, DeMeco Ryans, and that offense and the whole team in general performs with all these lofty expectations when people actually expect them to do something. Because they caught the league kind of by surprise last year, in my opinion. And to see how they perform year two, is the sophomore slump going to be a thing? Not to dive into Houston too much. It's his Cowboys podcast, but it's an interesting storyline.
It really is. And we've talked about previously how comparison is the thief of joy. You've talked about your frustration watching other teams like the Eagles make moves, Houston now making a ton of moves. And of course, the Cowboys did make a move yesterday as well, kind of around the same time as the Stephon Diggs trade. I personally thought it was pretty smart. They brought back Chuma Edoga, who agreed to terms. And he was a guy I thought had a lot of value in availability last year. What's sometimes the best ability is availability. And even though he dealt with some injuries too, when it came to it, he stepped in for guys at both guard and tackle. And I think that versatility is a good insurance option. And I think that's something that was probably smart to go get. They didn't have a swing tackle. I mean, you can have Awesome Richards. You can throw him in there. Matt Waletzko. But now at least you have some competition for that swing tackle role. Danny, I don't think you and other Cowboys fans, kind of a polarizing move, actually, to bring back Chuma Edoga. I think you guys are not as high on him, some of you.
I think, and you could attest to this, the amount of times I would text you on a Sunday or a Monday or Thursday, whenever the Cowboys would play, and Chuma would step onto the field, and the amount of times I would text you with just pure frustration. Like, what is this guy doing on the field? Why is he in the game? Why is he still on the team? And to see him get re-signed, and it hurts a little more when the news drops almost simultaneously with your in-state, you can call him a rival, I guess, but making the trade for Stephon Diggs. Meanwhile, Jerry and Steven and Will are reeling in Chuma Edoga. And it's the most Cowboys move I've ever seen. To be honest, I don't like it. I didn't like him in the game last year. He wasn't a good guard. He wasn't a good tackle. I think he started 16 games, allowed something like 14 pressures. But the Miami game is the one that just sticks in my head. And the performance he had, sure, in those 6 starts, he had some good moments. He didn't get beaten all the time, but that Miami game has just left this impression in my head that I just can't shake. And I'd rather see let's go or see what you have in year 2 with Hakeem Richards. I'm all about throwing depth at the position and seeing what sticks. Are there worse backup swing tackles in the league? Sure. But not Chuma for me.
See, do you not find value, though, in his ability to be versatile and available last year? And by the way, you said 16 starts originally. You then corrected it with 6. But I was like, what did I miss? Chuma was starting 16 games?
If he made 16 starts, we're not making the playoffs. I can guarantee you that.
Do you not find I find it's a nice insurance option for a low risk.
Versatility is good, but when you're not really good at any one position, what's the value in that?
Well, agree to disagree, because also, Danny, they don't have a lot of insurance right now because they don't have a lot of depth on that line. So
In
draft is coming.
Jerry, in Jerry we trust.
That's the first time you said that on this podcast. So,
I have to
so
lie to myself sometimes as a Cowboys fan. I got to say things that even I don't believe. Makes me
is
feel
it like an exercise of like, like a conscious thing? It's like, sometimes I'll tell myself like I can run that mile, even though I know I'm not going to be able to do it unless it's a Taco Bell mile. Everyone view this podcast so I can do this Taco Bell mile and I could set the world record for a thing that has not previously existed. Anyways, is it something like that where you just have to like goose fraba, tell yourself, hey, Cowboys got this. They're going to go 12-5 probably. They're going to get or 10 wins and make the playoffs.
That's what being a Cowboys fan is. You have to lie to yourself and to others, quite frankly. At least living here in the Bay Area, I have to defend the Cowboys in times when they're not really defendable. And then after the conversation, I'll look at myself in the mirror. I'm like, did I really just say that? Like, that makes no sense. But what you got to do?
Joey, you need to clip that specific segment, and we're going to send that to our fantasy group chat, which is filled with a bunch of San Bruno kids. They're going to love that he admitted to that, just FYI.
That stays between me and you, okay?
On a public podcast that is getting thousands and thousands of downloads?
They don't have to know about that.
All right, well, I might tell them. Anyways, also in the news yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, or it was since the last time we recorded, Jerry Jones was named the second most valuable sports person in the world behind Stan Kroenke, which kind of surprised me. I knew, obviously, Stan's got a bunch of teams, but that was like, oh, okay. Anyways, Jerry Jones, breaking news, Jerry Jones has money, Danny.
You don't say.
Yeah, what a shock. So that was interesting, and I think that that's going to be a good segue to our conversation with Joey Ickes, who is even though he doesn't like titles, well, he's a financial extraordinaire in my opinion. But then again, a lot of people are financial extraordinaires compared to me. This is not exactly a nerd wallet podcast. So we're going to talk with Joey looking at the Cowboys salary cap situation. And he's got some really unique perspectives on it as a finance guy himself. He also does a great job, as Danny talked about earlier, really making some of these things relatable. The cap, all the financial stuff can really go over some people's heads. We got a journalist, a firefighter, and a producer in this podcast, so we're not exactly, Wall Street here. And I thought that Joey did a great job giving real life examples and explaining to us novices. So let's dive right into our conversation with Joey Ickes. All right, now we're going to welcome in our very first guest here on How About That podcast. We're bringing in Joey Ickes, who's been, covering the Cowboys for a while. He's worked for Cowboys Wire, The Athletic. He's, got a really good Twitter following. He's been producing some great stuff. He's also finance extraordinaire. I know he's not a diva, but, we're going to give him the elite titles here. Joey, thank you so much for being our first guest and coming on the pod.
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be the first guest. That's pretty awesome. I love the name of the podcast, by the way. I'm not the super creative kind of guy when it comes to naming stuff like this. This is it's perfect. I love it. But I'm glad to be here, and this is something that I've been talking about for a long time, and it finally feels like with the actions of the team this year, it kind of feels like it's kind of brought enough of a groundswell of kind of dissatisfaction among the fan base that people are starting to understand and see what I've been talking about for a few years with this team and with the league in general.
Yeah, no doubt. You had a tweet, I think it might've been earlier this week, where you kind of talked about how, hey, anyone can watch all 22, but that doesn't mean that they understand the exact X's and O's that have gone on, on a certain play or the behind the scenes, what strategy was going on. And you kind of equated that to Over the Cap, which is kind of a great resource that we all have. It's something I use often, but I'm also not a finance guy. So I can look at it and probably in the same way of someone who's not a football expert watching all 22. So with that being said, I kind of want to run through a little bit of numbers really quick from Over the Cap and then kind of defer to you on some thoughts. Right now, I think the big thing that's kind of sticking out to me is that the Cowboys, we talk a lot about the cap, obviously, and spending. But if you look at active cash spending currently for 2024, they are dead last with $188 million, which is about, if you do the ratio between active cash and what their cap space is, it's about 75% of what their cap space is what they're actually spending. And you compare that to the Philadelphia Eagles, who have $289 million of active spending. That is quite literally $100 million in difference between two NFC East rivals. A couple other notes really quick. In 2024, according to Spot Track, 22nd in current cap space right now, which is roughly about $6 million, depending, give or take. And then in 2025, they are 10th in cap space. So there's this idea that the Cowboys are really, really struggling to find cap space right now. But if you kind of look at the numbers, it seems like there's options there. Joey, what are your first kind of thoughts, on that in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm glad you talked about cash because it's something that over the past few years, more and more of my attention has turned towards what are teams spending in cash. Because for a long time, I've kind of known and understood, like, you can kind of do whatever you want to do with the salary cap. It's why there's the whole idea that the salary cap itself is a myth and all this other kind of stuff. But cash is cash, right? Like there's no changing the accounting for cash or anything like that. You either spend it or you don't. And if you're spending, and usually if you're trying to win football games, you spend more cash on more good football players that will help you win football games. And if you're not trying to win football games, you don't spend cash on players who would help you win football games. And so it's kind of, I don't want to say scary, but like it's kind of weird to look at the Dallas Cowboys, the most valuable franchise in all of sports, and see that, like you said, they're 32nd in cash spending this year. They're near the bottom of the league in terms of least dead money on their cap this year, which means they have not over the last 2 years, despite what people want to tell you, been pushing cap into future years and then are just eating this massive amount of dead cap this year. That's not the case. And for the last 3 years at least have been in the bottom 5 in cash spending for each of the last 3 years. They had to do some contract renegotiations last year just to get to the cap, to the spending floor for cash. There's a window of time from 2021 to 2023, and it's in the CBA. It's a 3 or 4 year rolling period. You have to spend at least 90% of the cap in cash. The players, the NFLPA understands that cash is what really matters and that the cap can be manipulated. So they said, hey, you got to spend up to 90% of the cap. The Cowboys had to move some things around, and all those extensions they signed last year right before the start of the regular season, they had to get to the cash floor. And they still were 28th in overall cash spending last year or something like that. So you're looking at it the right way, and that you're looking at cash in relation to the other teams in the league, and you're seeing, man, one team is spending $100 million a year more on players than another team. And we wonder why it feels like the Eagles are constantly in contention and constantly pushing to take the next step and do the next thing. Do they hit every player? Do they make the right signing all the time? No, not necessarily. But one thing you can guarantee is that Howie's going to go out there and he's going to push to try to get the next guy, the new thing. How can he make the weakness in his team better? And that's just not something we've seen the Cowboys do.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up dead cap too. One, we talked about the Ezekiel Elliott possibility the other day. He's got $6 million in dead cap this coming season, but in total, according to Over the Cap, the Cowboys have roughly $16 million in dead cap on 2024 in their salaries. Zeke Elliott, Tyron Smith, Dorrance Armstrong, Leighton Vander Esch, Kelvin Joseph, and Jabril Cox right now. That's to your point. They haven't really pushed a ton there. $16 million isn't that much, all things considered. We know next year that might, depending on what happens with Dak Prescott, could change a little bit there in terms of how that's inflated. But you also brought up the idea of it being kind of scary / weird that, hey, this is America's team. Jerry Jones is literally the second, according to Forbes' report this week, the second most valuable sports person in the world behind Stan Kroenke. This is a team that you think that would go all in and kind of do that. And I thought it was interesting. I was doing more research on you, Joey. Sorry, I'm a professional stalker. But you had a story in 2022 about how could the Cowboys go all in? And that was a year before Jerry Jones even thought of the idea of going all in. One, if you don't mind, can you kind of touch a little bit on some of the thoughts that you had, at least the 2022 season, kind of going into that, push. And Cowboys were obviously doing very well at the time on the field, but close, but not there. And just kind of what it was like for you to watch Jerry and the rest of, the kind of the front office say, hey, we're going to go all in, only to kind of pivot to let's do more with less?
Yeah, in terms of Jerry saying this year that they're going to go all in, they've made it pretty clear that what they mean by the word all in is not, hey, we're going to dump everything we have into trying to win football games. It's we're going to put all of our decisions on what happens this season. So what happens with Mike McCarthy depends on what happens this season. What happens with Dak Prescott depends on what happens this season. What happens with Micah Parsons might depend on what happens this season. What happens with, all of the whole coaching, everybody's on 1-year contracts at this point. And yet they're not giving them help. They're saying, okay, if we're going to extend you, if we're going to give you more time as the head coach, more time as the quarterback, etc., you're going to have played really well this year. And the hard thing is, like, they're not giving them the resources to be able to do it. Like, they're actively choosing to save $2 million instead of re-signing Jonathan Hankins. They're actively choosing, you know what, we're not going to spend $6 million on Tyron Smith in actual base salary. We're going to go this other route. We're going to play Brock Hoffman at center, who's not a real life NFL player at center. But that piece of it, I always hesitate to believe that they're going to go all in. And at this point, it's one of those things where Jerry's almost the talking head at this point. You guys understand this. You guys are as close to this stuff as I am. Like, he's a talking head at this point. He's at arm's length involved in the day-to-day decision-making, if even that. And the way that he reached the point that he is in his life is by going all in and taking the huge risk and all that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, the folks who are in charge of making those decisions now, we'll name Stephen Jones specifically, that's been the opposite of the way he's reached it. He's reached it because he did almost nothing, got an engineering degree from Arkansas, worked as a junior engineer for 8 months, and then became an executive vice president of an NFL franchise. Like, that's the person who's in charge of making decisions for this team. In his mind, you don't have to take big risk in order to achieve big things. You don't have to push. You don't have to go spend a lot in order to receive a lot, because he's never had to do that. In terms of back in 2022, this is kind of it's almost an annual exercise at this point for me, where I try to explain to folks early in the offseason, like, they're going to tell you they don't have cap space to do these things that you tell them that other teams are doing. Here is very early evidence in March, April, February of every year. They could take these 3, 4, 5 moves, create $60 million in cap space, and do anything they want to do. And by 2 years down the road, it's all washed away and it's all gone anyway. And so I do that on almost an annual basis, where, like I said, the salary cap, you can almost do whatever you want to do. The comparison I like to make is I compare it to the income tax system, where, like, regular guys like you and me, right? Like, we pay income taxes, death and taxes, right? It's the only 2 things you can count on in the world. I guarantee you, if you got Jerry Jones and asked him how much he paid in income taxes last year, the answer is 0. And he made, 1 million times more dollars than we did, had way more dollars to spend than we did. He paid $0 in income taxes. Why? Because he knows the system. He knows how to avoid paying the income taxes. The salary cap is the same way. If you know the rules and you know how to work around it, you don't have to ever worry about being out of compliance with the salary cap, no matter how much cash you actually spend. And so I try to just exhibit that and show that on an annual basis, that these are the moves that you can make. And there's almost infinite numbers of them that you can make in order to stay compliant with the cap while spending an extra, $100 million in cash above the cap.
As someone who just paid a couple $100 in taxes, that one kind of hurt a little bit. So thank you, Joey.
It's the one thing that I found that, like, every normal human being can relate to is the pain, especially this time of year, right? Like, everybody right now can relate to the idea that, like, taxes are coming. There's nothing you can do about it unless you are extremely rich and you know the tax code and you have really well-paid accountants that can take care of that for you. It's just a different story for those kind of guys.
It's kind of funny how the offseason times up with that too.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to go to Danny really quick. Danny, obviously being a Cowboys fan, you said that when the Eagles signed Saquon Barkley, it made you sick just thinking about the move they made, and two, what Saquon Barkley could do behind that offensive line, even without Jason Kelsey. Hearing Joey talk about the finances and the idea that we've kind of heard for a long time that the cap can be a little bit, it's real, but it's also a myth. What kind of goes through your head hearing Joey kind of break down as a fan what's going on with the Cowboys cap situation?
It's almost more frustrating just hearing the amount of options or the things that you can do excuse me, to manipulate that cap, and seeing how Howie Roseman does it year after year after year, and they're spending all this money. And now to hear Joey say that they could be doing said thing, they're just choosing not to. It's extremely frustrating. Why are you going to tell a fan base we're all in? And I think Joey had a very interesting perspective on what all in meant to him. Because as a fan, and I'm sure I could speak for most Cowboys fans, we take that for what it's worth. When your owner, GM extraordinaire says we're going all in, we expect all these big moves to happen. And again, to see Trent Sieg re-signed as your quote all in move to start, it just makes you want to pull your hair out and question what are we doing, Jerry? Like Will McClay, Stephen Jones. It's perplexing. It really is. And I think I'm more frustrated now after listening to Joey than I was 30 minutes ago. So thank you, Joey.
Glad I could help, Danny. Glad I could help.
All Joey's doing right now is bringing pain. He's reminding me of my taxes. He's reminding Danny of all in, not gone through. But Joey, as our first guest, I think that's perfect. Joey, one thing you talked about a little bit on Twitter too, and again, you should go follow him on Twitter. I have somewhere written down your exact @ We'll bring that up later. I'm pushing that off. But you kind of talked also about the Cowboys kind of not signing guys early and what that could kind of do for cap space. And I think Dakota Prescott in that kind of situation right now is a good example. Can you explain a little bit what you meant by that, the value of doing that, and also kind of maybe how it compares to where they're at currently?
Yeah, so we'll use Dak as an example, right? So Dak signed his current contract in March of 2020, May of 2021, right? That was after a franchise tag season and another franchise tag. He signed a 4-year contract. Because he signed a 4-year contract when he was not currently under contract, that contract is only for 4 years, which means that when it comes to cap manipulation and spreading money out over the course of the contract, you only have 4 true years to spread that over. Now, the concept of void years is something that's come in vogue over the last 3 or 4 years because of what happened with the pandemic and the cap associated with that. But it's been around forever, the idea of using void years. So you have some extra leeway there. Go look at Jalen Hurts' contract if you want some fun with void years and all that kind of stuff. That's a fun read. But let's use Dak Prescott this year, for example. Dak has 1 year left on his contract. If he were to want to sign another 4-year contract, which I think would be reasonable, get back to the market around the year, around the time you're 35-ish, have another shot to take another 3 or 4 year contract before the end of your career. If the Cowboys sign that contract next year, you now only have 4 years to do that contract, unless you take more void years, do more things out in the future. But if you were to sign that contract this year as a 4-year extension of his current contract, you now have the last year of his current contract, which you can now manipulate base salaries and all that kind of stuff because it's part of the new contract, and 4 more years on top of that. So you still have 2024 and you have 25, 26, 27, 28. Now you have 5 years with which you can move cap money around. Also, you add that to the fact that the quarterback market just consistently rises. I don't think Trevor Lawrence is a better quarterback, has produced better results than Dak Prescott, but Trevor Lawrence is going to get a contract extension soon. And he will likely get a contract extension at or near the very top of the quarterback market. And when he does, all that's going to do is that's going to take it from Joe Burrow's number at about $55 million to now all of a sudden the top of the quarterback market is $57 million because that's where Trevor Lawrence signed. And then the next quarterback, whether it's Jordan Love or Dak or whoever else signs that next contract, they're going to get another contract on top of that. So the earlier you sign, the faster you get in ahead of those guys. And you also get more beneficial flexibility when it comes to cap construction and adjustments and things like that, because you have essentially a 4-year contract that turns into a 5-year contract when it comes to, we pay the signing bonus now, we spread that signing bonus over this year and the next 4 years instead of just the next 4 years plus a void year. So it allows you to spread everything out even more. And when the cap is rising the way it is, spreading the cap over multiple years is a massive advantage. It's a huge advantage when the cap is rising. And I've talked about the economics of that a lot of different times on Twitter. It's kind of a weird economic concept that's hard to explain on Twitter, but it makes sense for sure.
So simply put, by pushing contracts off with a cap that is constantly rising, you're basically kind of lowering percentage-wise what that cap hit actually is, because your cap gets bigger year in and year out if you push it off.
Right. So let's compare it to buying a house, right? If you bought a house in 2019, right, you probably bought it at like 3.5 or 4% interest, and you bought it at, a certain value. Let's say it was a $200,000 house at that, 4% interest rate or whatever. If you bought that house on a 30-year mortgage, you spread that $200,000 out over 30 years. You pay interest on it, yes. But now if you waited and said, no, I'm going to wait 5 more years and save up more money, now to buy that same house, you can't buy that house for $200,000 anymore. That same house is probably, depending on where you live, $500,000, $600,000, and you have to pay 7% interest on it instead of paying 4% interest on it. So like I've seen people on Twitter say that there's like 2 classes of people in the world. One class is people that bought their house before 2021 and have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And the other class is people who have not yet bought a house, or who bought a house after 2021 or without a fixed rate on their mortgage. Just because the increase in cost to buy the same house, to get the same quarterback now, is cheaper than getting that same quarterback will be a year from now or 2 years from now. And with the way the cap continues to rise, it just makes all the sense in the world to buy it as early as you can buy it and lock in the lowest possible interest rate you can lock in, because the way the cap inflates, it's going to make it feel like the cost for that quarterback goes down over time as opposed to going up.
So Danny's a firefighter. I'm a reporter. Joey's a producer extraordinaire. Other Joey. Long story short, we are not math guys. Ultimately, journalism, we kind of try to stay away from that math as much as possible. Kind of in closing here, Joey, if you don't mind, for people that are not football experts watching all 22 in terms of, financial people kind of looking at cap space and trying to understand it, what would be your best advice for the casual fan trying to understand, hey, the cap can be maneuvered and can be moved, and this is why it's relevant to what the Cowboys are doing? What would be kind of your final advice / conclusion for all of this?
What I would say is, to look at what teams like the Eagles are doing. Even like the Saints get criticized all the time because they, every year they're $80 million over the cap for the next season. And then all of a sudden they're back in compliance with the cap, and they haven't released anybody that they wanted to keep. They haven't, had to trade anybody that they wanted to keep. They just move money around and all of a sudden they're compliant. And there's so many new, if you really want to learn it, you can go read the CBA and like be a big nerd like me and have it saved on your desktop and all that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing to do is, it's kind of like watching all 22, right? Is that like sometimes you don't know what the backside safety's responsibility was in the run fit. And you might assume, hey, he's supposed to come down to this spot, but really his responsibility is the cutback on the other side or something like that. And you may blame that guy. So when you go into watching tape, if you don't have a deep understanding of scheme, just understand there's some things that are going to happen here that I may not fully grasp, and I may have to go ask somebody. That may be the biggest thing. Just ask somebody that pays attention to this stuff. And the thing is, Cowboys Twitter is honestly like relatively blessed in this area. Even if you don't consider me, which, like you said, I'm not a diva. I'm not big on titles or like woohoo, rah, rah, me or anything. But KD Drummond from Cowboys Wire is amazing with salary cap stuff. he and I started talking about this stuff in G chat in like 2014 or something like that. Is when we really started to dive deep into this stuff. Patrick Walker from DallasCowboys.com is really good with cap stuff. There's several of these guys out there that are talking about this stuff in a really intelligent way. And also on Over the Cap, one of the most valuable pieces of Over the Cap is, yes, they have all this information, all the details of the contracts. But when just about any contract gets signed of note, Jason, who's really good with this stuff, will write an article analyzing the contract. Hey, this is what the contract is. This is how much the signing bonus is. They're prorating it over this number of years. They can release him as early as the third year of the contract and save $20 million against the cap that year. He does all of that kind of stuff. Just go try to digest as much as you can digest and read as much as you can read. Or when you see something that seems unusual, just ask. And if I haven't seen it or don't know it, I can go find out relatively quickly.
Well, Joey, thank you so much for coming on, man. I know you're not big into titles, but I have no problem calling you financial extraordinaire. If I have CBA questions, you're going to be my guy. Maybe tax advice next season, so I can lower down my what I owe to the government. But thank you so much. You can find Joey on Twitter. He does a fantastic job there at Joey Ickes, Ickes. No underscore or anything. Just that's what you have. Anything else you want to promote or anything else you want to talk about?
Nope, that's it. You guys are doing a great job, and I'm excited to have been a part of being your first guest.
Yeah, we're going to have like a little sash for you that says, "How about that podcast #1 guest?" Coming.
There you go. I like it. All
right, Joey. Thank you again, and tune in for the rest of the pod coming up here shortly.
Absolutely.
Thank you again to Joey Ickes for coming on the pod. As we talked about before in the lead up to him, that was really insightful stuff. Danny, you didn't have the chance to ask him a question though that was on your mind, and if you want to bring it up here, you can.
He was talking all these financial terms and being very serious, which is what we're looking for. But in the back of my head, I couldn't help but wonder, because he's talking about the salary cap going up. And the question that kept popping into my head is Taylor Swift the reason the cap went up? Is this whole Kelsey Swift phenomenon that just took the world by storm? Is that the reason the cap went up?
It's a great question. Taylor Swift was obviously very captivating for the NFL audience. It brought in a whole bunch of Swifties. I thought the funniest thing about the Taylor Swift NFL crossover was when Jason Kelce rumors of his retirement first happened, and you saw Swifties on TikTok making tribute videos to Jason Kelce's career with like the song "Long Live," like really emotional stuff. They had film cut-ups from the Kelce documentary, and I was thinking, you go back a year ago, in what world is anyone expecting Swifties to make tribute retirement videos to Jason Kelce?
No, I'm having full-on conversations with my mother-in-law about the Kelces and Jason Kelce and all these things that I never would have imagined having a year ago. That's the power of Swift and the Swiftie army nation. What do you call them? I don't know.
I think they're just Swifties.
Sure.
All right, we'll go with Swifties. Speaking of the power of things, I think the power of Taco Bell can help get us views and listens on this podcast and can grow our audience, which is why if we get 2,000 views, downloads, I believe is the term, downloads before May 15th, I will be running a Taco Bell mile. You may be asking yourself, what is a Taco Bell mile? It's in homage to a beer mile where I eat a Taco Bell item that we'll choose before every single lap, and I have to run a mile. And according to the third eye raven himself, the breaker of ties, the insightful one, I thought that this would be a new thing, and apparently not.
No, I looked it up just out of curiosity. Taco Bell mile, those 3 words. That's all I looked up. A few results came up, not a ton. So I only clicked on one video, and it was the one that said world record with the asterisks next to it, because I thought, if this person is proclaiming to have the world record Taco Bell mile, they have to have run something decent at least. That kid ran a 9 minute and 50 or 51 second mile eating Taco Bell in between every lap.
Do you know what he ate in between the laps?
I can't name Taco Bell foods because I don't know what they are.
Dude.
That's a bold-faced lie.
I know
That's not a bold-faced lie. There's definitely like some little burritos in there, and there's something in a bowl with cheese on top. It all is just
like he doesn't know the name of these things.
This is ridiculous. Do they stop the clock and then he runs, or it's literally just
no. You have to. It's the whole time. You don't get a stop clock because if you eat it fast, then you should get rewarded for that, right? If you eat it slow, you should get penalized.
I think we can set early odds or early time marker over-unders now about what I could do in a Taco Bell mile. Danny, do you have a stab at what my time might be?
Well, having seen you run around a track quite a few times in high school, 9 minutes might be a little tough for you to beat because that was also 12 years ago. You mix in a couple Taco Bell items, some cheesy gordita crunches, some Mexican pizza is your favorite, which you
please can we not do a Mexican pizza? I mean, we'll have one item be chosen by the audience.
Let's set it at 8 minutes 15 seconds.
That's the over under?
Yeah.
Dude, no way. I was thinking like 10:30 is like a good
oh my god, I'm giving you some more credit than that.
To eat a full quesadilla, which I'm presuming will be the one. Let's say a beefy 5-layer burrito, a cheesy gordita crunch, and a Mexican pizza. To eat all that and run a mile,
but you're never stopping, so you're always moving. You're not going to sit down at a picnic table and eat while you.
No, I don't think you can eat and run. I think you have to eat and be stopped.
Well, you can't eat and walk.
I don't know. I'm pretty sure with the beer mile, you can't move while you drink. You have to drink it and then run, and then drink it and then run.
Is this something that could get you in the Guinness World Book by chance, Joe?
We have to reach out to this. Maybe we should have this guy on the podcast to talk about it. Maybe get some insight, some news. Joey, can you reach out to this person? Is this a YouTube thing?
I'm definitely gonna look more into the Taco Bell mile, see if there's anything that beats 9:50 because it's good. That's a good time, but that's not like a shockingly good time.
I think we should reach out to this person. I think that would be a fun podcast guest.
We can see.
All right. Well, let's move on from Taco Bell, which is difficult for this podcast, apparently.
Your favorite.
And we'll do the round 3 of the Chase for the Rose, which is we're getting into it now. We are down to the final 4, which is good timing with kind of what's going on in college basketball too. And we have some heavy hitters here and a kind of unique, versatile group here, an eclectic group, if you will. We have the number 1 seed. Did we establish what it's Fuaga, Taliese Fuaga, right?
Fuaga.
I believe.
Funga?
Fuaga.
It's Fuaga. Yeah, okay. So Taliese Fuaga from Oregon State, the number 1 seed, the favorite, still in the game, going up against the 13 seed, Oregon center Jackson Powers-Johnson. Perhaps I think that's our Cinderella in this group, the darling of all Cowboys fans right now. And then we have the 6th seed going up against Laiatu Latu from UCLA, edge rusher, going up against Texas's Byron Murphy II. And that's a pretty good group. I think one thing to note so far, 3 of the 4 guys are visiting or taking 30 visits with the Cowboys. I don't believe Laiatu Latu is. We can double check that. I don't think so. So that's 3 guys that not only are we interested in, Dan, but the Cowboys are interested in too.
We are. And this first matchup, which is Fuaga,
we got to be better about that.
I believe after listening to NFL Network, they pronounce it Fuaga, but even they could be wrong. So who really knows? And this matchup for me is 2 of my favorites, but it comes down to what's going to be your best 5 on the O-line, who's going to be at their best positions. And for me, I know, and we all know that Tyler Smith can play left guard, or he can play left tackle. He's obviously an all-pro left guard. I think we keep him at guard. We put Fuaga at left tackle. I think he can make the transition. I think he's athletic enough. I was watching Jeff Schwartz break down, who knows a thing or two about the O-line, and just watching him salivate over the film with Fuaga had me sold. So that's what it comes down to for me is assembling your best five. Yes, Jackson Powers-Johnson addresses an area of need, but I wouldn't completely hate going into the year with Brock Hoffman as your center. You got Bass as well as another interior option. I think it's harder to find that staple at left tackle than it is to find at center. That's what it comes down to for me, which makes Fuaga my pick.
I think you bring up an interesting point about what is the best starting five. And in this case, let's just say the starting three from center, left guard, left tackle. And you brought up a good point. I personally believe Duke Merriweather was talking about this on Twitter, who's another offensive line expert, that you keep Tyler Smith at left guard. I think a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush in that scenario. You know that he is a fantastic left guard. Sometimes you watch him last year, and even I think it was Zach Martin would talk about it sometimes, where it's like, technically and fundamentally, is he completely sound right now? No, he's still a little raw. But sometimes he would make these, Brian Schottenheimer was the one who talked about this. And I have a story about this actually on LoneStarLive.com, where there was a play where Tyler Smith, I think, got thrown off balance in practice, where it's like, okay, easy, hurry, potential sack. He's off balance. He's done. But he was so athletic and so strong that he was able to overcome that and still block the guy. That is just, he's kind of a freak there. And it makes you wonder what that freakish ability would do at left tackle. So hypothetically, Dan, say if you draft Jackson Powers-Johnson, and let's say in this scenario that you do not draft a guard, or a guard in this case, another left tackle or another center prospect after the first round. So in this case, you move Tyler Smith to left tackle. You have TJ Bass at left guard, who played well last season. And then you have Jackson Powers-Johnson at center. Is that better than Fuaga at left tackle, Tyler Smith at guard, and then maybe like Brock Hoffman / Tanner Bordolini, the guy from Wisconsin, at center? Which one does that sounds better to you?
They both sound better than what we have. I like them both because they don't include Chuma Edoga in your plans, which is fantastic. That's a tough question. But what we do know is that Tyler Smith is a damn good left guard, and he's only developing into a better one. To see where he's come from, this guy who had the knock coming out of Tulsa, that all these holding penalties and not that athletic, and is going to have a tough time transitioning to the NFL, and to prove all that wrong going into year 3, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I think the sky's the limit, and I think to move him to left tackle, which he might be able to do, I don't want to stunt that growth. You got the next Larry Allen at left guard. Let's just keep that, fill that hole at left tackle. So now you have a young left tackle to pair with a young left guard. The left side of your line is set for the next 10 years. Let's go with that. Centers, no disrespect to the position, but I think it's a little bit easier to find a solid center, which you can protect a little bit more. You can slide your protection. If you're weak at left tackle, you're going to get exposed. So let's shore that up. Let's get our franchise left tackle early.
It's funny. The more we talk, I start talking myself into possibilities. And the idea of Tyler Smith playing left tackle, I think he could actually do it really well. I think left guard is where I want him to stay, right? But for the sake of conversation, I don't think it's the worst call if you move him to left tackle. And then if you're talking about the center position, I think Jackson Powers-Johnson, if he wasn't a center, would be a top 8 prospect in this draft that you're getting there. I think it's not hard to find centers, right? Tyler Biadasz was a 4th round pick. And he was, and he was very solid for 3 seasons as a starter. Exactly what you want. How often do you get the chance to elevate the center position, though? To have a guy who's 6'5", 320, and who's so quick and athletic. And I know apparently there's a narrative now about his health. For the sake of fun on this podcast and the sake of getting the third-eyed Raven out of the cave and into the conversation, the breaker of ties himself, Joey Aliberti, give me Jackson Powers-Johnson. Let's move Tyler Smith to left tackle. We have TJ Bass and Brock Hoffman duking it out of left guard. And then we see what happens. And now we go to the third-eyed Raven himself for the decision. Does Cinderella survive? or does the number 1 seed slay Cinderella?
The Oregon Duck is clouding your judgment here, Joe.
Slightly, for sure, but let's have fun on the podcast.
I actually don't hate the idea of what you just proposed of how they would shift around the offensive line with Smith moving out left and then the competition at left guard, moving JPJ to center. But I'm going to have a lot of fun in saying that I think Fuaga should move on. And I think JPJ should have been out in the first round when he was up against JC Latham. There was no consideration for JC Latham, which I thought was crazy. JC Latham, some people think he's the best tackle in this class. And he just got brushed over because, we got an Oregon Duck in here. And we got someone that just he likes a big moving lineman. And I think that clouded the judgment of how JC Latham should be perceived and why he was a 3 or 4 seed in this. So I think the JPJ hype train has to stop here.
Can I have a rebuttal?
Yeah, I mean, it's your podcast.
It's true. One saving grace for this is we've already passed on JC Latham. So, to your point, if we pass him, why not pass on Fuaga too? The other thing too, ultimately, this is not who they will draft at 24. This is not even who will be available at 24. This is draft crush. This is who gets our rows on this podcast. And let's just put it this way. 24 is around. You pick Jackson Powers-Johnson, Taliese Fuaga. Who excites you more going into the offseason? Danny and Joey, go. That's my
for the sake of reality. I think it's a long shot if Fuaga's actually there at 24. It seems like he's sliding up, going up draft boards. Just looking at Twitter, NFL Network, all these sources, it seems like people are falling in love with him more and more. And there's going to be a pretty big tackle run in the first round, which could push some guys down to us at 24. So for the sake of reality, I don't think he'll be there. My dream scenario, I'd love to have him. Joe?
Is he more of a draft crush to you than Jackson Powers-Johnson?
Yes.
Okay. Joey?
It's close, but it just comes down to position. I'm sorry, but your Oregon Duck cannot play left tackle, which we need.
I mean, have we ruled that possibility out? I mean, we saw him play guard at the Senior Bowl.
Unless you want to put Jackson Powers-Johnson at center, and since you love Edoga, we could just kick him out to left tackle since he's so cheap.
I don't think Chuma Edoga should be the starter. I do like Chuma Edoga, though.
I will say I think Fuaga was one of my draft crushes. JPJ seems like an awesome guy. I would be surprised, honestly, if he did not have a good NFL career. He seems like a very safe draft pick, but so does Fuaga. And I think he just has a higher ceiling as a tackle to make a huge impact on the Cowboys. And that's why I'm going with Fuaga.
I'm going to have one more rebuttal because I want to. What if Fuaga is a guard?
Then Tyler Smith's probably the left tackle.
I know, but so what I'm saying is, what if it's like, hey, they go into camp, Fuaga, honestly, they didn't have to, they had a lot of DJU kind of staying in the pocket, not dropping back super deep. He gets speed rushes. I think we need to move him inside to guard. Tyler Smith, we got to move to left tackle. What if that happens? Are you still that more excited about him at guard than you are Jackson Powers-Johnson at center?
I almost like that even more because you have Smith and Fuaga. You're not helping yourself.
I'm throwing Hail Marys here, Dan.
You got these two guys competing at left tackle. May the best man win in camp. And your consolation prize is you have a stud at left guard. It's a win-win scenario.
And a question mark at left tackle.
I don't think that was a question mark.
You admitted yourself Tyler Smith is going to be a damn good left tackle. He's a great left guard. He's a great left guard, but he could be a damn good left tackle. So let the best man win.
I'm looking for a white flag because I'm waving it in defeat. All right. Taliese Fuaga moves on to the finals. He wins the Battle of Oregon between the Oregon State guy and the Oregon Duck, unfortunately, to this sad Duck's chagrin. Anyways, let's move on. Up next, we have an all-defensive matchup in the other side of the Final Four bracket. UCLA's Laiatu Latu, edge rusher, versus Texas's Byron Murphy II. Danny, what are your thoughts about these two different yet very talented defensive players?
I posed this question to you last episode, and it was, do you think the Cowboys have a problem or a need getting and generating pressure from the outside? And to that, my answer was no. I believe you said the same thing.
I said yes, or I did say no. For this is if we're on the stand here, if I put my hand on the Bible and I'm under oath, I said no.
So their most pressing need is not generating pressure from the outside, correct?
No, but I think if you let me explain, Mr. Lawyer, that it may not be the most pressing need, but I think you kind of look at if like the adequate requirement is the middle part of the spectrum, right? And need is to the weaker side, and value and kind of overachieving values to the right. I think you can suppress one need by being elite in another thing. And I think if you have two elite edge rushers, not only are you getting after the quarterback even better, but you're doing something that not a lot of teams have. And that's have two edge rushers. And that allows Micah Parsons to also line up in the A gap and have pressure there, which is kind of something you're going to want from Byron Murphy II. Am I right?
Yes, but does putting Micah Parsons in the A gap, which granted they wouldn't line him up on an obvious rundown anyway, but does Micah Parsons in the A gap stand a chance against a Jackson Powers-Johnson in the run game? No, he doesn't.
Oh, see, that's throwing salt in the wound. Are you serious?
So I'm not really sure where you're going with this. We've had elite pass rushers in the past, and it hasn't helped our run game one bit. So much so that they had to use a first-round pick to address the need last year. Hankins is gone. So sure, we can keep putting these speed rushers on the outside and moving people around like the old NASCAR package the Giants did, but it's not going to stop the run. So I don't know if you watched that Green Bay game like I keep alluding to, because it's a pretty fresh wound for me. We got to start addressing some needs here, Joe. So let's put some beef in the middle and let's get Byron Murphy in there.
Which scenario do you like more, Danny? Do you like Byron Murphy and Xavier Thomas, or do you like Laiatu Latu and T'Vondre Sweat?
Those are two different things. I mean, Sweat's a big boy. He's no Byron Murphy, obviously.
My point being by asking you that, would you rather have an elite edge rusher and then come back and get a defensive tackle who I think could stop the run, like T'Vondre Sweat? Or would you rather go elite defensive tackle and then try to replicate Dante Fowler Jr. with an edge rusher that has some questions? That's my point.
Your point to me is questionable because you are making Dante Fowler seem like this special pass rusher, this commodity that we're going to be missing so dearly. And yes, he had an ability to get to the quarterback, but to say he's not replaceable with a mid-round pick,
you're getting lost in the Dante Fowler thing. My point being, they didn't have an elite edge rusher opposite of Micah Parsons. That's my point. So
I guess we don't know who DeMarcus Lawrence and Dorrance Armstrong are. Oh, okay.
Well, one, Dorrance Armstrong's gone, and two,
we're talking about last year, Joe. You're losing yourself.
Well, we're also talking about edge rushers, like true speed threats off the edge. We're not talking about DeMarcus Lawrence, who is fantastic. We're not talking about Dorrance Armstrong lining up over tackle. We're talking about guys off the edge. We're talking about the fastest and quickest way to the quarterback conventionally.
Which doesn't matter if they hand the ball off. You can get to the quarterback.
But then you could replace that with T'Vondre. You could get defensive tackles later on in the draft, who I think are still adequate. Byron Murphy, in my opinion, is the best interior defensive tackle.
Okay.
Right?
Sold.
And Laiatu Latu is the best edge rusher in the draft.
It comes down to need versus want.
But I think you could excel. You could fill the need at defensive tackle later on better than you could fill a need for an edge rusher opposite of Micah Parsons.
And how has that worked for the Cowboys the last few years?
They haven't done it.
So why are we going to keep throwing people out of position of need?
Because you don't have an elite. You didn't have an elite guy there, and I think he would be elite.
To be honest, I think you can thank the front office for getting the Cowboys in a situation where they can't take a Latu at 24 because they can't take best player available because there's so many needs. You have to draft for need. because you failed to do so in free agency. Granted, maybe they'll add some people a little bit later on, but you're kind of hand-tied here at 24.
All right. So is that your closing thought on that?
Yes.
All right. My closing thought is you can find solid defensive tackles later on, and you can't find elite edge rushers later on in the draft. With that note, Joey, the Third Eye Raven, the breaker of ties, this is probably the most contentious one I think we've had.
I agree. And I looked into just a little bit of who the highest paid edge rushers in the NFL are and who the highest paid defensive tackles in the NFL are, because getting paid a lot of money usually means you've had a successful NFL career to that point. And there is some of both. Trey Hendrickson, I think, was like a third, fourth round pick on the edge. Like I said, with Danielle Hunter, he was a second round pick or something like that. For defensive tackles, Justin Madubuike, he just led all defensive tackles in sacks. He was a round 3 pick. You have Zach Sealer out of Miami. He was a round 7 pick. Chris Jones, round 2. But at the same time, it's so tough. And I think both players would add a very fun and good element. I think Byron Murphy just makes too much sense here. If the Cowboys have Byron Murphy on, or if Byron Murphy's on the board at 24, I think the Cowboys would be psyched.
So would I.
I will tell you, Joe.
Are you kidding me? You baited and switched so hard on that. You're like, oh, hey, I can find Justin Madubuike in the 5th round. Oh, hey, Zach Sealer, 7th round pick.
You can find Trey Hendrickson in the 4th round.
Nick Bosa, TJ Watt, Myles Garrett. What do all those 3 have in common? 1st round picks.
Aaron Donald, Christian Wilkins, Quinnen Williams, Ed Oliver. There's just as many defensive tackles.
Yeah, but I guarantee you, if we fully flesh this out, the ratio between high-end first-round picks and success and Pro Bowlers at edge rusher is a lot closer. That's not the right term. Then there'd be more option, or there'd be more like late-round picks at defensive tackle that went on to become Pro Bowlers.
I know what you mean, and I don't think picking Latu would be a bad pick because funny enough, I keep saying Trey Hendrickson. He keeps getting comparisons to Trey Hendrickson. And if the Cowboys had Trey Hendrickson and Micah Parsons on the edge or doing whatever, that'd be crazy. But at the same time, Byron Murphy is a very, very special defensive tackle. And like Danny said, they need a defensive tackle. They're obviously Mozzie Smith, the jury is still out, 1st round pick from last year. So he could be really good. He could end up being a very important part of this Cowboys defensive line. But even if he is, or even if he isn't, Byron Murphy, having him next to him or having him as someone that will be an effective defensive tackle, I think is very, very important.
You don't think there's a Dorrance Armstrong sitting out there in the 4th round again, Joe?
I mean, there are some guys. The one that really blew my mind was Austin Booker, another Kansas guy, actually, was how good he looked at the Senior Bowl and then how slow he looked at the Combine. That was just like a wild juxtaposition. Anyways, to your point, yeah, you can find other defensive ends.
That's my point. Is Dallas?
You can find other defensive tackles, Dan.
You've already lost the argument. I mean, we've already made our pick. You're done. It's over.
You feel so confident with another. This is back-to-back years with a 1st round pick defensive tackle. Are you? So by doing this, you're kind of putting a huge, huge, huge red flag on the first, second-year jump for Mozzie Smith.
Why? The Eagles picked Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter back-to-back years.
That's a fair point.
I think you're showing the fans that you realize you have an area of need and that you're going to address it. You're going to stop throwing these, like you said, these late-round picks at defensive tackle just because they weigh 340 pounds that they can stop the run game. Well, they can't, as we've seen.
You don't think, though, finding another edge rusher opposite of Micah Parsons is important?
I think we have that. We have pieces that can do that to an extent. They're not elite, but do you need elite across from Micah Parsons?
Who?
DeMarcus Lawrence?
That's defensive line. We're not talking on the edge.
A hometown favorite of mine, Viliami Fehoko, could be that jump in round 2. We don't know.
You brought the St. Francis guy on this podcast. Come on, man.
But to my point, it's like you take a Quentin Bohanna.
That's another DN, by the way. Sorry, go ahead.
Like a Quentin Bohanna. No offense to him, but You're throwing these big bodies out there, and it just nothing really works. You got to change it up.
I think my last point, it'll be easier to find a defensive tackle that can fill the need that they need in rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5 than it would be to find an edge rusher there. That's just my last thought.
I disagree.
You might end up being right, Joe. And T'Vondre Sweat, I mean, from a run stopping standpoint, I don't know if there's any better defensive tackle than T'Vondre Sweat, but I think they'd want something more than that. Someone that can be a good pass rusher. They just lost their second best pass rusher in Dorrance Armstrong, obviously. So now they need something to kind of help do both. Byron Murphy could be
Also,
that guy.
I'm not saying that the run defense is not a need. It clearly is. Again, my point being that I think they could still adequately fill that later on. I think you could go, hypothetically, Laiatu Latu round 1, a guy like Patrick Paul round 2, T'Vondre Sweat round 3. That's a pretty good. I think Cowboys fans would be pretty okay with that.
I don't hate it, but I just think there's better ways to go about using your draft capital.
All right.
Based off
Joey-
current instruction.
Joey, are you you're settled with that? You're good?
My one last question. Do you think T'Vondre Sweat would fall to round 3? It feels like he's gonna go round 2.
I don't.
He's had this like up and down thing where like he's like risen, and then after the combine he actually kind of dropped a little bit in terms of people's mindset. Long story short, good players fall around 3 all the time too. So I think that would be a chance for that to be available. So that's my last thought on that. But you guys are decided. It's Byron Murphy, the DeSoto kid himself, who I love, by the way, as a prospect. That's I just want to make that clear. Moving on to the finals, going up against Taliese Fuaga from Oregon State. A 1 seed versus 7 seed. It feels a little bit March Madness-y. That's good. You know, we didn't have 1 versus 2. Sorry, Troy Faltonu and all his fans out there. But that is going to be our final matchup, and we're going to talk about that on our next podcast. If this round was any indication about what that round could be in terms of contentiousness, I think that we've got ourselves a fun argument ahead, Danny.
Bring it on.
Let's do it.
Bring it on.
All right. Before we go to a new segment to end it, I did want to bring up one thing. Earlier this week on LoneStarLive.com, I wrote about potential trade backs for the Dallas Cowboys and what that could look like. I think the trade for Stephon Diggs from Buffalo to Houston makes them an even more attractive potential trade up candidate, which gives the Cowboys a chance. We talk about all these holes. They could fill a lot of them if they were to trade back. I gave 3 examples online. You should go check that story out. But I also gave 1 example on Twitter that I've broadcast and I'll broadcast now. In this scenario, the Cowboys traded the 24th pick to the Kansas City Chiefs for the 32nd pick, a 4th round pick, 131 overall, and a 7th round pick, 221. And they didn't stop there. The Cowboys then traded back from 32 all the way to 44, so out of the first round with Las Vegas, who gave up a 2nd rounder and a 3rd rounder to do it. And I think, to be honest with you, in that case, if they were coming up for a quarterback, Dallas could get more. But just for the sake of a display and a showcase of the idea, the Cowboys then drafted West Virginia center Zach Frazier at 44 overall, Texas running back Jonathan Brooks in the 2nd round, Western Kentucky's Malachi Corley in round 3. I know you're a fan, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
Another 3rd rounder in Patrick Paul from Houston, a 4th rounder Xavier Thomas from Clemson, 5th rounder tight end Jaheim Bell out of Florida State, linebacker Jalen Ford in the 6th round from Texas, so another Texas guy, 7th round pick Marcellus Dial, a corner from South Carolina, defensive lineman from Illinois Keith Randolph Jr., which would be the first true defensive lineman, interior lineman in this draft mock, and then 7th round Marshall running back Rasheen Ali. You get 2 running backs, a chance to kind of double dig, especially with Jonathan Brooks coming off an injury. Dan, we texted about this a little bit offline. You kind of didn't like that haul, but what do you think about the idea of trading back and what that could be for the Cowboys?
I like the idea of trading back. Just to make sure I'm clear, you had their first selection in the draft being at 44.
Correct.
So the hard part I have with that is this whole all-in mantra we've talked a lot about. They've done nothing in free agency aside from Kendricks. And then you take that into the draft and you trade all the way back to 44. So now it just seems like a complete lie to the fans. Not only did you do nothing in free agency, you've completely traded out of the first round. It's almost like this quiet rebuild you're talking about. That's like it's almost like a wave and a white flag to me. I do like trading back in the draft, but I think they should stay in that first round. 30 through 32 would probably be the floor for me. And to trade all the way back to 44 and then to come away with a center as your first pick, that's I can just imagine Cowboys Twitter day one of the draft having no picks, already being pissed like myself. Oh god, it would be bad. It would be bad.
You know, too, that like the moment that the 32nd pick got traded, that the camera would immediately flash to a Cowboys fan, like night one of the draft there.
With the big foam Cowboys hat, his face all painted and everything.
It's the Bud Light guy with like all the cans on his and like the horns, and he's just like, I've waited all night for the 32nd pick, only for them not to pick someone.
It would be bad. But it's tough because I had a similar reaction when they took Travis Frederick in the first round. And they announced him with all these other names on the board. And I was like, what? A center? Frederick who? And then fast forward, he had a great career, ended a little soon. And then I had the same reaction. I'll never forget it. I was at work watching the draft, and they take Tyler Smith. And leading up to that, they had talked about all these Tyler Smith to the Cowboys rumors and how he's got all these penalties with all these holding calls and his technique's horrible. And then they took him. And I saw all these players left on the board, and they take Tyler Smith. I go, what are we doing? And it worked. So for me to question their draft strategy, it's kind of blown up in my face for the best. But I think going to 44 is a little too much for Cowboys fans to swallow.
I think one thing that was interesting in the research too, and Joey, I want to get your thoughts on just this idea here in a second, but one of the things that was interesting was if you look at teams trading up obviously into like the top 15 or the top 10, they're every time giving up a first round pick in next year's draft, a lot. And I know Jerry Jones has talked about we're not going to think about next season. We're all in this season. So getting a first round pick in next year's draft would not be good. But conversely, it doesn't take that much actually to move up from, let's say, 35 to 24. There's not a lot of draft haul that goes back and forth. I did look at one trade, though. Last year, Buffalo had the 24th pick. They moved back, or Jacksonville, excuse me, had the 24th pick. They moved back twice, got 3 extra picks because of it, only going to 28 in order to do so. So maybe that's something where the Cowboys go back to 28 with Buffalo this year. They're able to get a 4th, a 5th, and a 7th to do so. And next thing you know, one, you have a 4th round pick again for Dallas. And now you have 3 other swings that you didn't have to go get good players. Joey, what do you think about this idea of the Cowboys trading back?
I want to say first really quick, Joe, if you were the GM of the Cowboys, would your perfect draft being them draft Zach Frazier and Jackson Powers-Johnson?
Yes, because I think you go center. I say we move JPJ to tackle. That's my opinion.
It seems like those are your 2 big crushes of the draft, other than Latu, obviously, as we have previously discussed. But I also completely agree with the notion that you can trade back, but if you trade back out of the first round, the message that sends to everybody is just terrible, terrible, terrible compared to just saying all in. I really don't understand why Jerry Jones said all in, unless because I remember on the first podcast, I said, I don't know what they could do to make an all in move. If they are really all in, I think trading that 2025 first would show that they're all in for this one specific season.
I think other Joey, though, hit it on the head. And this is what I believe what all in is now is this is the last chance of this for this head coach, these assistant coaches, and it might be for this core. This might be the last chance, as we talked about with Dak Prescott and expiring contract. So we'll see what happens there. All right, well, that's kind of it for the podcast today. But I want to introduce kind of a new segment. Danny, this is what we're going to call what's on Morales' mind. There's some alliteration there. Eminem. What I want to do is just give you the floor. You are the closing argument of this podcast. What is on your mind today? It could be football, it could be anything else. I mean, shoot, it could be about, this one mustache trimmer you found that you're just in love with. I don't know, free advertising. But what is on your mind, Morales?
The mustache is all natural, so it doesn't get too much manscaping. But what's on my mind, and I kind of forgot about it for a while, and then it kind of resurfaced when they announced that McCarthy was coming back. Is McCarthy the right guy to lead the Cowboys in 2024? It doesn't seem like they're giving him much to work with. It's almost like they want to see him do more with less. And that Green Bay game left such a sour taste in my mouth that this team just seemed so unprepared on the biggest stage. And in the McCarthy regime, that's kind of been a theme when it matters most, that they don't show up. And as a fan, you see all these big names out there, your Belichick's, and I even like Dan Campbell. But to see McCarthy come back, my initial reaction was anger, frustration. The performance in the playoffs was so bad that you're going to tell the Cowboys fans that we trust this guy. We're going to ride with that guy. And he's back. He doesn't have much to work with. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of coaching performance he puts forth this year. And is he the guy long term? I don't know. If you were to ask me today, I don't think he's our guy. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in 2024.
I think that is the theme. I know all in has been the theme of the offseason. I think all eyes on Mike McCarthy. And he's talked about it. He has no stress about that. And he's not tripping. That is the theme of this season. It's not only make or break for this entire core, but I think it's make or break for Mike McCarthy, which is not a shocking thing. But that's where we're going to leave this podcast. Well, thank you everyone again for listening. Share this podcast so we can get those 2,000 downloads so I can run this Taco Bell mile and set the world record. Follow me on Twitter at Joe J. Hoyt. Joey Aliberti is Joey_Aliberti, right?
Joey _Aliberti 1.
Why 1?
Because I guess Joey _Aliberti was taken, which I don't know who has that name, but
I think Joey
for some reason
Aliberti.
the 1 had to be in there, sadly.
We have to seek out other Joey Aliberti and take this from him. We have to,
teach him a lesson. I'm down.
we got to teach him a lesson. So
I also realized I said Dan Campbell was available. I meant Dan Quinn. Sorry for the.
Well, there was a point where they're like, "Hey, former Cowboys tight end Dan Campbell." That was. I didn't think it was a misstep because that was like it was fleeting, but a quick like, "Oh, what if?" We
need to bite some kneecaps in Dallas. I'm all for it.
There you go. All right, well, share this podcast, review it, download it, just listen to it. That is very appreciated. Thank you, everyone who already has. I think, we're in this for the long haul, and we're building an audience, and you, the listeners right now, are the foundation of this podcast. So thank you so much. And that's another episode of How About That Podcast.
Thanks for listening to How About That Podcast.